Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Takshashila Institution's All Things Policy podcast. I'm your host, Jaison, and in today's episode, I have with me Pranav Gupta, who is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. Now, Pranav has appeared in some of the other episodes, in the not so recent past. And in today's conversation, there's a very interesting survey that has come out on AI adoption in school education. And again, these are questions which are evolving, and we don't have a complete picture of. But this serves as a snapshot as more and more students begin to integrate AI in their academic routines, lessons, etc. So, what is the future of the Indian education system per se, as far as the adoption of AI is concerned? And that's what the focus of this conversation will be. So we basically address how AI tools are transforming academic habits of students, their impact on exam preparation, time management, the overall learning journey. And so we look at what's the extent of reliance on these AI tools, where the student depend most on AI, and how the purpose and extent of the use vary across various streams and tasks. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Hi, Pranav. Nice to have you back on the Takshashila podcast.
Thank you so much. Happy to join you for another conversation.
Yeah, so Pranav, we are having a chat today to try and unpack the survey findings, as I'd mentioned earlier, that was on the AI in school education. So if you could maybe set the context for us on, what motivated CPRG to sort of take on this particular question. And it is an interesting question, right? And how does this, fit within, the urgency of, the Indian school ecosystem in being able to adapt to AI. So yeah, if you could maybe just get us started on that front.
Yes, definitely. So at Center of Policy Research and Governance, we have been, for the past year or so, we have been trying to work on understanding AI adoption in India in various ways, in various spheres, and education being one of the focus areas. So previously, we had done a study on AI adoption in higher education among college students, and we had spoken about that earlier. And then we realized that, of course, apart from college education, there is significant, substantial adoption or use of AI tools. And when I mean AI tools, I mean generative AI, I mean specific AI based tools for learning at the school level as well. And the idea was to do a similar exercise to map or to empirically understand what is the level of AI adoption among school students, and not only just understand the level of adoption, but to also get a perspective on what are they using AI for, how does that compare to other technologies that they use, and what are some of their apprehensions and concerns about AI use. So so that was kind of the broad objective of what we wanted to study. And for that, of course, one specific thing is that, of course, our study is kind of limited to private school students in Delhi. So, of course, the findings cannot be generalized to all students. But we know that a significant proportion of students study in private schools. So it still represents a substantial proportion of the overall student population.
Got it. So on that note, Pranav, like if you can maybe just give us a quick overview of the methodology that was employed in this survey. So like who did you survey? Like as you mentioned, these are 10 private sector schools in Delhi. And what were some of the core questions? I'm sure the research team had a core set of questions they wanted to sort of seek specific answers to. And so what were those? So if you could just walk us through that.
Yeah, so I'll give you a brief snapshot of the main headline findings and the methodology. So we went to about 10 schools across Delhi, 10 private schools across Delhi, interviewed about 900 students. And these were all in-person interviews that we did at their respective schools. And we went to students of class 11th and 12th. And and in terms of questions, the one thing that we tried to map was what is the frequency of AI use among students, and what we find is on average about 50% students reported using some form of AI tools at least multiple times a week. And this frequency also kind of varies slightly across streams, with relatively higher AI usage or more frequent AI usage among students in science stream as opposed to humanities and commerce. So that was one idea, which is just to figure out what is the frequency of AI use. Then we try to understand, are there certain subjects that students are more or less likely to use AI for? And we find expectedly that what we find is that there's greater AI use among for subjects which are more kind of objective or problem solving oriented. So more use in those cases. And then thirdly, we try to understand how does AI use compare with respect to other tools. And when we say other tools, we mean like a particular focus is on edtech and language and supporting tools, or now in the market there's specific AI learning support tools and generative AI broadly. So generative AI would mean the usual ChatGPT, Gemini platforms. And what we find is that in terms of AI use, the primary use is essentially using these generative AI platforms. But one interesting thing that's coming out in the study is that while, of course, it's wrong to say that AI has kind of replaced edtech completely, but what we find is still relatively high use of AI, which is comparable to the level of reliance or use of edtech tools. So in some ways, definitely AI is posing some sort of a challenge to traditional edtech platforms that have become very popular among students in the past over the past few years, especially when it comes to preparing for school board exams. For entrance exam prep, of course, perceived helpfulness of edtech platforms, offline tuitions definitely remains significantly higher than generative AI. But still, a sizable proportion of students do find generative AI to be useful for these purposes. They are still using AI, and they are using generative AI for these purposes. Now, in terms of like actually what kind of academic tasks are students using AI for? So there, very interestingly, what we find is there's a distinction between learning concepts versus practicing questions or using AI for question solving. So while of course there is high AI usage among students of sciences, students of accounts, etc. But when it comes to problem solving, there's relatively lower perceived usefulness of AI when it comes to like specific problem solving, and there's more reliance for understanding concepts. And there's one specific reason for that, which is that what we find is that many of these AI models are still, the accuracy in terms of problem solving is still not 100%, still not very, very high. So this is kind of a very, very brief, broad snapshot of our findings.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting, and I really love to get into a sort of deeper conversation on some of the insights from your survey findings. So one of the things which, like, I intuitively, was thinking of, while going through your findings was like, the process of learning, right, is usually something where the focus is on the content, right? But are there any insights to gauge from the survey in terms of how AI is affecting the manner or the way in which students learn, right? And not just what they produce. Because if you look at AI as just a content production tool, but from something which also enables students to even, ask intelligent questions, right? That also becomes important. So how has the process of learning using AI changed beyond just content generation?
So yes, so that's a very important question. And when you go to students to ask for this, two things essentially stand out. Number one is, as I said, what are they using AI for? And then there's a very clear preference for using AI for essentially understanding concepts. Like that's kind of the main purpose that students are using AI for. That's where perceived helpfulness is also relatively high. And secondly, when you compare, like when you ask them to appraise AI or compare AI tools with, say, traditional forms of learning or other ICT based YouTube or ICT based platforms for learning, there seems to be a very clear preference. There's no clear preference for AI. In fact, one could argue there's a very clear preference for other platforms. So the fact that students still find in-person traditional methods of learning, teaching, pedagogy to be better indicates that despite high AI usage, what this indicates is that they're still thinking about AI. And when I say AI, I primarily mean generative AI as a supplement, as opposed to, say, the new primary source of learning and information. And which is why, and that said, I think usage is definitely much more than, say, just generating content and using that. Because if we think about that, in that case, use of AI would be limited to, say, writing assignments or writing projects and all of that. But what we find is that considerably high proportion of students are reporting that they're using AI for understanding concepts. And when they're using AI for understanding concepts, then it's not just about generating content from AI and then using it as is. Then what that means is that they're entering into some sort of a conversation, some sort of a learning process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is true even if it's for searching for academic information, right? Like that's, say, the main one of the main purpose for which students are using AI. Even that indicates that it's a recursive process. It's not a dynamic. It's not a static process of just generating some output and then using it as is.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think that I think ties well to the question of how AI is actually being used as a study companion, right? And I wanted to specifically understand, what are some of the use cases there? Like, how is generative AI used as a study companion? Like I think the classic example is at least when we were in school and we had a math problem. To perform calculations, you actually needed to jot it down on a paper, or even maybe have a calculator in hand. So do you see a higher usage of, let's say, AI, generative AI, for some of these higher order tasks, or do you see students using it like more creatively, like in the study companion, in being able to assess the students on what their answer script may have been? So do you see students using this as a companion, right? I mean, using AI to be effective in giving them, like, feedback, right? So is there a feedback loop mechanism that you see with the students using AI?
Yes. And I think there's an example that I would like to give. So when you say the traditional idea, okay, you are solving a math, you're studying maths, you're trying to solve math questions. Now you would use a calculator to get some of the calculations, or you would go to somebody to understand how do you solve this, to know how do you solve a question. Now, for, as I mentioned, because accuracy of models for such questions is still not high 100% or close to 100%. There are challenges that students face, and they're reporting this in in our study as well when it comes to using AI directly for problem solving, because they're also thinking about the process, right? Like one, as there's an accuracy problem constraint. Second, even if there's no accuracy constraint, students don't necessarily only need the answer, right? When you're thinking about an IIT question or a board exam question, what they're also interested in understanding is the process, the steps to get the right answer, right? It's not only about getting the right answer. And there are cases where students have reported that while the model gave the correct answer, it gave a method. Now for each question, especially questions in math, sciences, etc., there could be multiple ways of approaching the same, multiple methods of approaching the same question. Now, if the platform gives you a solution which is the right answer, but the method uses something which is not even relevant for your particular grade, class, then that answer is not very relevant to you. So, which is why we are finding some limitations, constraints when it comes to direct problem solving, which is why most students are using it for understanding concepts, clarifying concepts. So, wherein what it means is that then the learning becomes more of a conversation. Okay, I'm not able, and this is what students reported in interviews, like saying that, okay, so if we don't understand, say, a particular law, if we don't understand a particular rule, we go and we type that out. Okay, can you explain this? And that is also where where AI tools become somewhat helpful, because there is no end of the model will keep telling you as much as you ask, right? Which is, and that is something which students also appreciate in some way. And in some cases you can give a very specific instruction, right? Like, explain this to me in very simple terms, explain this to me as if I have very limited basic knowledge. But that said, when we specific, because one major idea which is discussed when it comes to learning through AI tools, is the idea that AI is essentially going to assist adaptive learning. AI is going to ensure students can learn as per their individual needs, as per their individual abilities. And there, when we ask students very explicitly that are AI tools helpful in addressing your individual needs, or are the solutions not specific to your individual needs and general solutions? So an overwhelming proportion of students said that the responses our solutions are more general as opposed to being customized or attuned to our individual needs. And that, I would argue, is more because of the nature of AI tools that students are using. So rather than using some of the specific, customized, specialized adaptive learning tools, when it comes to AI use, what most students are using are generative AI platforms, and that to free accounts as opposed to the subscription account. So, which is why, anyways, the ability of the platforms to provide adaptive learning to you is going to be limited. So, it's not a
Correct.
problem of the technology not existing. In that case, I would argue it's more about not being able to use or access that technology.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I also just wanted to bring in the dimension of the teachers and their preparedness for clearly what is seen to be as a greater adoption of like AI among the school children. So you know what does the survey, or does the survey address what are some of the gaps between students AI adoption and the teachers AI literacy? Because at some level, the teaching would also, and maybe the teaching aspect isn't covered in the survey. But any thoughts on how the teaching modalities can also infuse AI, and how can that sort of help with the process?
Yes, so that's a very, very relevant, very important question. So while we did not address this or look at this directly in the survey, but as I mentioned, around the survey we had conversations with various stakeholders. The survey was kind of supplemented by qualitative research, interviews with various stakeholders, including parents, teachers, and more deeper interviews with students. And yes, this is an important concern that we find among various stakeholders, that students have already, that this is not a case of a new technology existing and students being apprehensive about it. Students have, and this is, and as it is extremely evident in our study as well, right, that students have embraced the technology. They are using it actively. What is lagging in some ways is teachers you being able to use AI tools, and there are various use cases for teachers themselves wherein they can use AI tools to improve pedagogy. They can use AI tools to develop study plans. They can use AI platforms to improve their teaching, improve their pedagogy. So there are many use cases, but there's an extreme that there's kind of a lack of AI adoption, or it still remains relatively much lower among teachers. At least anecdotally, that is the sense that we get, which is why there's an urgent need for teachers to also embrace AI as a new technology, and urgently undertake upskill efforts to to develop some basic level of AI literacy.
Yeah. No, I think that's it's definitely something which will need to be addressed, because I think the pace at which AI is being adopted, even like among school children. I mean, the day is not very far, where the student might just be ahead of the lesson plan, right? Because they're just able to, and I think the survey captures this as well, the efficiency gains are so much more while using AI, that the student can of course rapidly get up to speed any of the lesson plans, or even if, let's say, they have been lagging behind as far as a lesson or a module has been concerned. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah,
Just
yes.
coming to, yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
you want
and
to add
just
something
one
there?
small thing I wanted to add on that. And what you said is very important also, because, and which is why any kind of AI training for teachers needs to not only include new teachers or those who are getting trained as teachers, but
Mm.
and that is where there's a stiff challenge. You also need to bring existing teachers on board when it comes to AI
Yeah.
training and AI literacy.
Yeah. And there you have, I guess, the adoption problem, right? Because old systems have served a purpose. So, you are sort of resistant to change it at some
Yes,
level. So,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Great. So, I know it's not all hunky dory when it comes to the use of AI. So, what are, and I'm sure, even our listeners can preempt, what could be some of those key challenges, but what is it that students reported to be some of the constraints or drawbacks even of using AI? And of course, we have to assume that, they don't use a paid version, or in some cases they may, but what have generally been the responses like in terms of the challenges of AI?
So, multiple things on that front. Number one, as I mentioned earlier as well, accuracy of models for problem solving still remains relatively weak. So, that is a major challenge for students. Second, our study was essentially among private school students, and that too in Delhi. So, there is, in some ways, a specific socioeconomic, geographical segment that we are
Sure.
going to. It's not a study which is representative of the broader school student population in India. And there's a large segment of school students where where access to digital devices is relatively low, and access to internet is also an accompanying challenge, and that is definitely going to be a major hurdle when it comes to AI adoption, because what it is going to require is a device and device with internet. So that access problem, or a typical digital divide problem, is definitely a challenge that needs to be looked at. In terms of AI hallucination, AI giving raw incorrect responses, we found relatively low sort of the proportion of students reporting these as challenges was relatively low.
Yeah, no, I think that's again, I think when you see the kind of the content that's generated by some of the advanced AI models, right? So if you speak of Claude and some of the LLM models there that are being used, I mean, that rate of change of how accurate they are, I think that's fairly accurate compared to what it was maybe a few months earlier. So I think it's just a matter of time before you have far superior models that's able to be very accurate as well. And I guess I think the takeaway here then, at least as far as I'm concerned, is how do you train the students to use AI in a more effective way, given that it's here to stay. But how do you train them to use AI in a way that works for them, but also helps them ask the right questions at the end of the day, and you can sort of build that AI skill, which is how do you ask the right questions, or you ask the AI to maybe challenge you, like for every response that is made. So yeah, I think that's also an interesting sort of insight that comes out.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And for that, students knowing how to use it is extremely important. And I can give
Important.
you an
Yeah.
example for that. For example, and this comes partly from the practical aspects of studying, or what is it, or our exam structure. Now think of a social sciences student, right? For a social sciences student, the right answer is essentially based on what in terms of their exams, or a board exam right answer is something that is mentioned in their respective textbook. So any additional information, or for that matter any information that kind of contradicts or goes against what is there in the textbook, has problems for students. So which is why what a savvy student would do is that a savvy student would say upload the textbook or upload their curriculum notes and kind of restrict or kind of input very clear constraints or boundaries
Guardrails. Yeah.
on
Yeah.
what the model uses for giving you answers. And
Mm.
that is where making students understand how to use these problems, how to use these platforms, how to give prompts becomes important to ensure that they're effectively using it. And why this is really important is that without this training or without these basic skills,
Mm.
they may end up, it's not that they may not harness the potential for these platforms, but the challenge is that they may actually be doing something, as they may be in an adverse situation.
Mm. Yeah, no, fair enough. I think that's something to sort of watch out for. Given that, I mean, I think it's there to see. I think the very savvy students who are already creative, in the traditional sort of learning methods, if they were to use AI, I mean, they'll just just outpace their peers, and I think that's really something that goes without saying. Pranav, so one of the other interesting aspects is, and we spoke about how AI is used as a study companion, but I think a very interesting dimension to this is how AI is a companion in itself, right? Because you might have students who you say quote unquote laggards, find it difficult to like understand concepts, better than their peers. So for them, is AI sort of a mental health support, right? In that they might be able to ask without any sort of fear of embarrassment, but also you know using it as a useful tool, like at the end of the day, because we know how it can be sometimes difficult, like in a classroom setting, for a student to be able to ask all the questions that's running through his or her mind, right? So there are the students who are inhibited from asking, and there are also students who are probably like just brimming with questions and are not able to use a classroom forum for this. I mean, or at least the Indian classroom setup has a long way to go before sort of tackling that. But where do you see the use of like sort of AI for a mental health, sort of support, be it as far as curriculum is concerned, or to get up to speed on curriculum, or even just otherwise, right? Like how is it playing that role?
So it's playing that role in two ways. So one is in terms of, yes, it is as you mentioned, it is potentially helping reducing the burden on students, and that is one reason why in our conversation we ask students like, what is it, if you're using AI a lot, why is it that you're using AI? And for that we found exactly what you said, which is a lot of students shared that this is a tool, this is a platform which is available to me on demand, number one. And number two, it's an entirely private conversation between me and the platform. I can literally say, I don't understand this at all. Can you explain this to me in absolute detail? Without anybody being judgmental, without anybody be coming up with any kind of preconceived notions. So that's very helpful. And of course, that is something that reduces the burden of learning on students. But in fact, on the mental health issue, what we're finding is that, of course, not a majority of students, not predominantly all students, but still a relatively substantial proportion of students are using AI tools for direct mental health support. So, for instance, in the survey, we asked how often do you use AI tools for mental health assistance, and about one-sixth of students reported that they regularly use AI tools for mental health support. So, which is an important use case, and a lot needs to be thought over about this particular use case because this has important implications.
Mm. No, I think that's quite fascinating, and we just see this like used in so many other contexts, right? I think the fact that there are avenues now to ask questions which you otherwise couldn't, or or where you were maybe told that you shouldn't be asking, right? So some of those, I'm sure all of us had, even our listeners tuning in would have had that classmate who had those wild questions. So yeah, it just makes it all the more possible to use AI for that. So just to round off the conversation, Pranav, right? So, and we have looked at how rote learning has been a sort of a feature of the Indian sort of education system, right? Starting from mugging up your lessons, sort of regurgitating that in your exams. So that whole the vicious cycle of homework and leading to test prep and then leading to examinations, grading. With the advent of AI, and this might just be a redundant question, and it might already be happening, but nevertheless something important to double click on is whether there is a transformative change that the use of AI is, or whether there's a transformative change that's staring in the face of the Indian education system, right? And since the survey focuses on the Indian context, I wanted to sort of stick to that. So, without passing any value judgment, what do you see this transformative change being with the use of AI? Now that we also have a snapshot from the survey that was done.
So I think we have to understand in terms of, we also have to, when we think about say, something like the prevalence of rote learning, we also have to understand the origins of that, right? So in some ways, rote learning originates partially also because of the way our exam system is structured, right? And unless there is a significant change in the exam system, the learning system may not change significantly, right? Because students are eventually, in some ways, still focused on the exam, and whatever way the exams or the assessments are structured, that is going to primarily shape the nature of learning. But at the same time, one major source of transformative change, and this is something which is not in terms, or not essentially in terms of how does the education system plan out or what is the learning process, but in terms of individual development, right? Because that eventually is the main focus of any education system or the process of education. Now, there we might be seeing important changes, and it's important to start documenting those, understanding those through research, because what is happening is that the entire process of learning in some ways is changing, which might be impacting cognitive development. Now, think about the past, where if I don't understand a question, I'm unable to solve a question, I will spend a lot of time with the book, I will go over the book again and again, I will try to figure out how to do it. Now that taking that time, of course that is time consuming, but that time is not wasted time. That time, that effort that I'm making had an impact on an individual's cognitive development. Now, if you think about the new normal, if you're unable to understand something, if the answer is if the answer or if the clarification is instantly accessible, there's always going to be a temptation of you going for that, right? And if you give in to that temptation and you draw that and you take clarifications or understand or clarity instantly, then you've lost that process that you would go through. And this is potentially likely to have a significant impact on individual cognitive development. This might have an impact on cognitive development. So these are things that we need to start studying and trying to understand what is the impact of use of AI on cognitive development. There have been some indicative initial studies, and the answers and the results are towards what I am hinting at, that use of AI platforms does impact cognitive development.
No, absolutely. I think that's just a larger problem to tackle, right? I mean, that's at least to my mind, something which has always plagued the Indian education system, is being able to like help the student learn how to think, right? So you don't give an answer, you basically help them arrive at their answer in a way that that helps them to think through like what are the possible ways to do it.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have to think about AI as a technology which, as you said, is going to stay. And if it is going to stay, we have to think around it rather than outside it or beyond it.
No, absolutely. I think that's something to definitely watch out for. So, as I say, watch the space. But I'm sure, once maybe this recording is out, we'll probably have, some new development in, the in the AI sort of domain, which might already have some use cases, for schools and for educators. So that's definitely a conversation worth having. But Pranav, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for bringing your sort of wealth of insights. I know you're an economist, political scientist by training, but yeah, it's always fascinating to also hear the sociological side to some of these issues. So yeah, thanks so much, and look forward to having a chat with you sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.